What if the greatest danger to your flight was not a storm or a mistake in the cockpit, but the engine sitting right outside your window? Deep inside it, steel discs spin under enormous force, and almost every time they hold. But every so often, one of them cracks, and in a single heartbeat, the engine explodes and sends red-hot shrapnel ripping through the wing beside you. This is the story of the crews who suddenly had to save an aircraft that was destroying itself. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. Every airline pilot trains for an engine failure. What almost none of them ever train for is losing the ability to control the aircraft at all. On a summer afternoon in 1989, one crew faced exactly that, high over the plains of Iowa, in a situation so far beyond the manuals that experts still study it in disbelief. They had a wide-bodied jet full of families, no working controls of any kind, and about 30 minutes before, gravity brought them down. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, a large three-engine jet flying from Denver toward Chicago, with 296 people aboard. Many of them were children, traveling on a summer promotion that let young passengers fly for almost nothing, and dozens of them were making the trip alone. The jet carried one engine under each wing, and a third mounted in the tail, and it was that tail engine that mattered most. Hidden inside its spinning fan disc was a tiny flaw in the titanium, a defect born during manufacturing that had slipped past inspection for years. About an hour into the flight, cruising at 37,000 feet, the flaw finally gave way. The fan disc tore itself apart and flung heavy fragments outward at enormous speed. On most aircraft, this would have been survivable, but the DC-10 of that era routed all three of its independent hydraulic systems through the tail, close together, and the debris sliced through every one of them at once. Within seconds, the fluid that moved every control surface on the aircraft had drained away. In the cockpit, there was a loud bang and a violent shudder, and then a discovery that no crew is ever prepared to make. The first officer pulled his control yoke in every direction and got no response. The captain tried and found the same terrible nothing. The jet would not answer them at all. Every tool they had spent their careers learning to use was suddenly dead in their hands, and the aircraft began a slow, uncommanded roll to the right that threatened to tip it over entirely. What the crew did next is why this flight is remembered. With no controls left, the only thing they could still change was engine power. The captain began working the throttles of the two remaining engines, speeding up one side and slowing the other to coax the wings back toward level. It was crude and barely worked, but it was something. Then a fourth pilot appeared at the cockpit door, an off-duty instructor who had been riding in the cabin as an ordinary passenger. He knelt between the seats, took the throttles in both hands, and gave himself entirely to the impossible task of flying a jet on thrust alone. Together, the four of them fought the aircraft across the Iowa farmland. The jet kept pitching up and down in a slow rhythm they could not stop, gaining and losing altitude with every swing and sinking closer to the ground each time. They could only turn in one direction, so they steered toward the small airport at Sioux City in a series of wide right-hand circles. The captain even found a moment to joke with the controller, asking whether they really needed to be particular about which runway they used. Beneath the humor was the truth. They were not sure they could reach a runway at all. The approach was unlike anything in aviation. The jet came down far too fast, sinking at more than twice a normal rate, with the crew wrestling the throttles to hold the wings level for a few more seconds. In the final moments, the nose dropped in one last swing, and there was no control left to raise it. The right wingtip caught the ground first. The aircraft slammed down and cartwheeled along the runway in a spray of fuel and fire, shedding pieces as it went, until the shattered sections came to rest in the surrounding cornfields. And then something almost no one expected happened. People began to move inside the wreckage. Survivors unbuckled themselves and walked out into the corn. In a crash that tore the aircraft apart, and by every reasonable measure should have killed all 296 people aboard, 184 of them lived. All four pilots survived, though they had to be cut from the crushed cockpit more than half an hour later. The cause traced back to that single hidden crack, a flaw that more thorough inspection might have caught in time. But the lasting memory of this flight is not the failure. It is the four strangers in that cockpit who were handed an aircraft that could not be flown and found a way to fly it anyway. Together, they turned a certain tragedy into the greatest survival story in American aviation. People in a quiet suburb north of Denver were out in their yards that Saturday afternoon when they heard a boom overhead and looked up to see pieces of an airplane falling toward them. A giant ring of metal dropped into a front garden. Chunks of engine casing landed on a lawn where children had been playing minutes earlier, and a huge circular part came down on a parked pickup and crushed its roof. Far above, A jetliner headed for Hawaii was trailing smoke from a shattered engine, shedding the very debris now scattered across their neighborhood. The aircraft was a Boeing 777, a large twin-engine wide-body carrying 241 people from Denver to Honolulu. It had been airborne only a few minutes, climbing through around 12,000 feet, when the crew eased the throttles up a little to get above some forecast turbulence. The moment they did, one of the two enormous engines on the wings let go with a deep, resonant bang. The failure started with a single fan blade. It was a hollow titanium blade, and a fatigue crack had been creeping through it for years, invisible from outside, and missed by the inspection built to catch exactly this. When it finally snapped, it broke near the root and slammed into the ring designed to trap it. Here, the engine did part of its job because the broken blade never escaped that ring. But the sheer violence of the failure shook the whole structure so hard that the outer casing and the front cowling tore loose and rained down over the town below. The engine caught fire and started throwing itself across the sky. The crew heard the bang, watched the engine wind down on its own, and got a fire warning almost at once. They declared an emergency and asked to turn back for Denver. Working through their checklists, they emptied both fire bottles into the burning engine, but the warning stubbornly refused to clear until they were well into the turn. Through all of it, the aircraft kept flying. It was built to fly on one engine, and that is exactly what it did. The passengers had a clear view of the whole thing out the right side of the cabin. The engine hung there, stripped to its bones, cowling gone, its guts laid open to the wind and still smoking. People filmed it on their phones, convinced they were watching their last minutes, and the footage was on newscasts around the world within hours. Yet there was no decompression and no loss of control. The plane was badly hurt but steady, and the crew kept it that way all the way home. On the ground, it could have been so much worse. The debris was strewn across more than a mile of a populated suburb, dropping heavy metal into yards, streets, and a park full of people on a weekend afternoon. One large piece punched clean through the roof of a house. Somehow, not a single person below was hurt, an outcome local officials could only call astonishing given how many people were outside at that hour. The captain flew a careful approach back to Denver on his one good engine and set the aircraft down without further trouble. As soon as it stopped, fire crews soaked the ruined engine and knocked down a flare up at its base, and all 241 people aboard walked off unharmed. No one on the flight or under its path had been injured. Most disasters begin with something breaking. This one may have begun with a question. High over the New Mexico desert, two crew members got curious about how one of their aircraft's systems actually worked and decided to satisfy that curiosity with a small experiment in the middle of a passenger flight. Less than a minute later, an engine had torn itself apart. A passenger was gone, and a jumbo jet was falling toward the desert. Whether the experiment caused it has been argued ever since. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, a wide body carrying 128 people from Houston toward Las Vegas on a clear autumn afternoon. It had 3 engines, one under each wing and one in the tail, and it was cruising smoothly at 39,000 feet. With the flight essentially running itself, the captain and the flight engineer fell into a conversation about the automatic throttle system, the feature that sets engine power on its own to hold a chosen speed. They wondered exactly where the system drew its information from, and whether pulling a particular circuit breaker might reveal the answer. Against every principle about leaving a working aircraft alone, they decided to find out. They switched the automatic system on, then pulled the breakers tied to the engine speed sensors to watch how it would respond. What they may not have fully grasped was that cutting off those sensors also removed the safeguard that normally kept the automatic throttles from driving the engines too hard. For a few seconds, nothing dramatic seemed to happen. They studied the result, satisfied their curiosity, and set everything back to normal, expecting to be on the ground in Las Vegas within the hour. A moment later, a tremendous explosion shook the entire aircraft. The number 3 engine, on the right wing, had disintegrated. Its spinning fan had broken apart and burst through the casing, hurling metal in every direction. Pieces ripped through the right wing, struck the other 2 engines, and tore a line of holes through the belly and the side of the passenger cabin. The cabin lost its pressure in an instant. Freezing air came howling in through the breaches, and gray smoke from the ruined engine poured through with it. One passenger had been seated at a window in the exact row where the engine let go. When the debris shattered his window, the escaping air pulled him halfway out of the aircraft. The man beside him grabbed for him and held on with everything he had, but the force was simply too great, and there was nothing anyone could do. He was pulled out entirely. His remains would not be found for 2 years, discovered by chance by workers out in the empty desert. The warnings hit the pilots all at once. 2 of the 3 hydraulic systems were failing. Generators dropped offline, and instruments went dark. The captain pushed the crippled jet into a steep emergency dive toward thicker air the passengers could breathe and set his transponder to the emergency code. The vibration was so severe and the rush of wind so loud that for 2 full minutes, the cockpit recorder picked up no voices at all. The crew fought to shut down the wrecked engine, only to find the shutoff handle jammed and its readings frozen in place. The passengers were fighting their own battle with the oxygen system. In some parts of the cabin, the masks were slow to fall or never dropped at all, and several people briefly passed out in the thin air. A few pulled so hard on their masks that the hot oxygen canisters came loose and started small fires, burning the hands that tried to bat them away. The flight attendants moved through all of it anyway, helping passengers breathe and bracing them for what was coming. Now the captain had an aircraft that wanted only to roll and twist toward its dead engine, and he held the controls hard over just to keep the wings level. One of the 2 surviving engines was losing oil and thrust as well, which meant he had no guarantee of reaching an airport at all. He turned toward Albuquerque, 60 miles off, and nursed the shuddering jet through a long descent. 19 minutes after the explosion, he put it down on the runway and brought it safely to a stop, and everyone still aboard escaped down the slides. Of the 128 people on the flight, all lived except the passenger lost through the window. When investigators examined the engine, they found its fan had failed through a violent vibration that shook the blades apart, but they could never fully settle whether the crew's experiment moments earlier had triggered it, because the flight recorder had captured nothing usable at the critical moment. 2 theories were laid side by side, one blaming pure coincidence and the other pointing at the throttles, and neither could be proven. What the investigation did state plainly was the lesson. An aircraft in flight is no place for curiosity, and even the most seasoned professionals must never test the limits of a machine that is carrying other people's lives. Almost every disaster in this video happened in the air. This one never left the ground. The aircraft was still gathering speed down the runway, seconds from lifting off, when a single hidden flaw turned an ordinary takeoff into a scene of horror and killed 2 people on a flight that would never even fly. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas MD-88, a twin-engine jet with both engines mounted at the rear of the fuselage, close beside the last few rows of seats. It was a short hop from Pensacola, Florida, up to Atlanta on a fine summer afternoon with a long, dry runway ahead. There were 142 people aboard, among them a mother and 3 of her children, heading to Atlanta for the Olympic Games that were about to begin. The 2 youngest took window seats near the back, where the view outside was partly blocked by the bulk of the left engine. Inside that engine was a part called the fan hub, a solid disc of titanium that anchors the spinning fan blades. It is one of the most carefully made components in all of aviation, built to survive far longer than it will ever be used, and almost impossible to break. But this particular hub carried a flaw dating back to the factory. Years earlier, during manufacturing, a drill had overheated one small patch of metal deep inside a bored hole, weakening it and seeding it with microscopic cracks. Inspectors had noticed an odd mark there and checked it against their reference cards, but it matched nothing they were trained to reject, so the hub was passed as sound. From the day it entered service, a fatigue crack began to grow inside it, a fraction wider with every takeoff. For 6 years, the crack spread unseen, moving from engine to engine, slipping through inspection after inspection, until it reached the left engine of this jet. By the afternoon of the flight, it had grown more than 3 centimeters long, and the hub was holding together by the thinnest of margins. The crew had no reason to suspect any of this. The walk-around check turned up nothing worse than a spot of oil and a couple of missing rivets, none of it serious. They taxied out, lined up, and pushed the throttles forward. 3 seconds later, as the engines spun up toward full takeoff power, the weakened hub finally gave way. It did not simply break, it exploded, bursting into heavy chunks of titanium that were flung outward with tremendous force. The largest piece tore downward, bounced off the runway, and flew hundreds of meters into a field. Another fragment punched straight through the cabin, entering the left wall near the last rows, ripping across the interior, and exiting through the right side of the fuselage. In that instant, the 2 youngest passengers were sheltered only by chance, while others nearby were struck by the flying metal. In the cockpit, every screen and light went black as the debris cut through the aircraft's wiring. The captain felt the bang, saw his instruments die, and immediately called off the takeoff. He braked hard and held the jet straight, bringing it to a stop on the runway just a few hundred meters from where the roll had begun. From where he sat, it seemed they had gotten away with it. The aircraft was stopped and there was no sign of fire, so he told the crew there was no need to evacuate. He did not yet know what had happened at the back of his aircraft. The rear cabin was a scene of devastation, filled with dust and torn metal and wounded passengers, and the flight attendants there, unable to reach the cockpit because the phones had gone dead, began an evacuation on their own judgment. Toward the very last row, one of them knelt on the blood-soaked floor and found that a mother and her 12-year-old son had been killed by the flying fragments. The investigation traced the whole tragedy back to that single overheated patch of metal from the factory, and to the long chain of inspections that had failed to catch the crack growing out of it. The deeper lesson was an uncomfortable one. Searching for a microscopic flaw in a part that almost never fails is a task poorly suited to human attention, tedious and monotonous, and a system built on that kind of vigilance works right up until the one time it does not. Almost a kilometer from the runway at Chicago's O'Hare Airport, workers inside a parcel warehouse heard something tear through the roof. A jagged piece of metal heavier than a grown man had punched into the building and dropped onto the floor. It was part of a jet engine, and the aircraft it had ripped free from was at that moment sliding down the runway wrapped in fire, with 170 people trying to get out. The aircraft was a Boeing 767, a wide-body bound for Miami with 161 passengers and 9 crew. It was a clear autumn afternoon, and the takeoff was routine as the jet built speed toward the moment of liftoff. Then, just short of the point where it would have left the ground, the right engine came apart. The failure began deep in the hot core of the engine, in a heavy spinning disc near the back where the heat and stress run highest. That disc was made of a special heat-resistant alloy, and it had carried a flaw since the day the metal was cast, nearly 20 years before. A tiny pocket of impurity had been sealed inside it, invisible from the surface and beyond the reach of any inspection then in use. Under the full strain of takeoff power, it finally split. It did not stay inside the engine. The disc burst and threw its pieces outward with tremendous force. One large fragment tore through the inner part of the right wing, opened up a fuel tank, and kept going, sailing nearly a kilometer before it crashed through that warehouse roof. Thousands of liters of jet fuel poured out of the ruptured tank and lit almost at once, and a pool of fire spread beneath the right wing. The crew heard a heavy bang and felt the aircraft lurch as they neared takeoff speed. The captain rejected the takeoff on the instant, pulling the throttles back and standing on the brakes, and brought the jet to a stop on the runway with room to spare. That was the right call, well executed. But the fire outside was already growing fast, fed by the torn, open tank, and thick smoke began seeping into the cabin until passengers could barely see the seat ahead of them. Now, everything depended on getting people out, and on a handful of split-second decisions in the cabin. The flight attendants could see the flames on the right, so they knew to funnel everyone to the left side and out. But one hazard was not obvious from inside. The left engine was still running. The checklist the crew were working through had not been written for a fire on the ground, so that engine kept turning longer than it should have, and its exhaust was blasting straight across one of the escape routes. A passenger who came down a slide near it was thrown to the pavement by the force of the jet blast, and was the only person seriously hurt that day. Inside, the escape was frantic. Smoke filled the cabin and alarms blared, and even with clear instructions, some passengers tried to wrestle their carry-on bags toward the exits, holding up everyone behind them. One flight attendant struggled to pull a bag away from a passenger, and finally let it go when the fight was only costing more time. Even so, the crew got everyone moving, down the slides, and away from the burning wing in a matter of moments. All 170 people aboard survived. The fire did not relent. Crews poured foam over the aircraft, but the flames had already eaten into the right side, collapsing much of the right wing and gutting part of the fuselage, and the jet was damaged far beyond any repair. When investigators fit the broken disc back together, they traced the flaw to the foundry 2 decades before the engine ever failed. A speck of contamination frozen into the metal that no approved inspection of the day could have found. This was not a story of a crack someone should have spotted. It was a limit of the technology itself, a defect buried so deep that the tools of the time were simply blind to it. Even a part built to the highest standard and checked exactly as the rules demanded could still be carrying the seed of its own destruction from the very first day. People in the towns west of London looked up that spring afternoon and saw something they would never forget. A jetliner was passing low over their rooftops with its left wing wrapped in flame, trailing black smoke across the sky as it struggled back toward the airport. More than 100 people were aboard, leaning away from windows too hot to sit beside, and the whole thing would come down to one young woman and a choice she made in the last moments. The aircraft was a Boeing 707, a long-range jet bound for Australia by way of half the world, with 127 people on board. Many were families. Some were emigrating to start over abroad, and a good number had never flown before. The takeoff from Heathrow was completely normal until the wheels left the runway. A second later, the inner engine on the left wing tore itself apart. A compressor disc deep inside that engine had shattered without warning and flung its pieces out through the casing meant to contain them. The engine died instantly. Worse, the blast had ripped open a fuel line, and fuel was now pouring straight into the heat and catching fire. Within seconds, the passengers on the left side were calling out that the wing was burning. The crew heard the bang and began running their emergency drill from memory, but a small and cruel tangle of timing worked against them. The engine had failed and caught fire in the same instant, and in the rush, the step that would have shut off the fuel to that engine was missed. The valve stayed open. A pump kept driving fuel into the flames at full rate, feeding a fire that soon looked like it had swallowed half the wing, and no one up front realized the handle had never been pulled. The captain understood his wing might not hold much longer, and he made the decision that saved most of the people behind him. Instead of flying a wide circuit back to the main runway, he turned for the nearest strip he could reach, a short one rarely used by a jet this size. As he brought the aircraft around in a steep turn, the burning engine broke clean off the wing and tumbled into a flooded gravel pit below, barely missing a group of boys who stood watching it fall. 3.5 minutes after leaving the ground, the jet was back on the runway and rolling to a stop. For a moment, it looked as though everyone would get out. The flight attendants threw open the exits on the side away from the flames and started pushing people down the slides and out onto the wing. Then the left wing tank exploded. Fire poured in through a breach in the fuselage, and the cabin crew knew they now had perhaps 90 seconds before the inside of the aircraft became impossible to survive. They shouted, they shoved, they hauled hesitating passengers toward the doors, and one after another people tumbled out into the daylight. Nearly 3/4 of the survivors escaped through a single forward door, far more than its designers ever imagined it could handle. At the back of the aircraft, cut off from the rest by smoke and flame, a 22-year-old stewardess was working alone. She had already sent several trapped passengers down the rear slide before it burned away, then urged others to jump from the doorway into the arms of a colleague on the ground. When the last of them was gone, 4 people were still deep in the burning tail. One was an elderly woman who could not walk. Another was a small girl who had lost her family in the chaos. She stood for a moment in the open doorway, close enough to simply step down to safety. Instead, she turned back into the smoke to reach them. She did not come out. When the fire was finally put out, 5 people were found together near the rear door, the 4 she had gone back for and the young woman who would not leave them. 122 of the 127 aboard survived, most of them alive, because the pilots put a burning aircraft on the ground in 3 minutes and the cabin crew emptied it in 90 seconds. The investigation would point to the fuel that was never shut off and the fire trucks that reached the scene too slowly. But the country fixed on something else. It remembered a young woman who had woken that morning expecting a routine day at work, and who decided at the end that her duty was not finished while anyone was still on board. For that, she was given her nation's highest award for bravery in peacetime, one of very few ever awarded to a woman. 20 minutes into an ordinary flight to Dallas, a woman was sitting quietly by a window over Pennsylvania when the world outside her seat tore open. There was a deafening bang, a violent lurch, and then the window beside her simply vanished, and the air pressure that had been holding the cabin together rushed out through the hole in an instant. In the space of a heartbeat, she was pulled halfway out of the aircraft, held to the world only by her seatbelt, while the people around her lunged to grab hold of her. This was not supposed to be possible on a modern jetliner. The aircraft was a Boeing 737, one of hundreds of the type flown by the airline, leaving New York for Dallas with 149 people aboard. It was a routine morning, climbing toward cruising height on a clear day. Leading the flight was a highly experienced captain, a former Navy fighter pilot who had spent years being told the job could not be hers, and who now had a spotless record over thousands of hours. Neither she nor anyone else on board had any reason to expect what was coming, because the danger was buried deep inside the left engine, in a place no eye could reach. That engine was driven by a large spinning disc ringed with 24 fan blades. Each blade was locked into the hub by a flared root, gripping tighter the faster it turned. But the manufacturer had underestimated the strain those roots endured, and over thousands of flights, a tiny fatigue crack had formed at the base of one blade. It had been growing quietly for years, hidden beneath the blade's protective coating, too shallow for one inspection to catch, and not yet due for the deeper check that would have found it. By the morning of the flight, that crack had reached the breaking point. As the jet climbed through 32,000 feet, the cracked blade let go. It broke clean off the spinning hub and slammed into the case around it. The engine was built to trap a broken blade inside that case, and it did. What no one had accounted for was where the blade struck. It hit at the exact spot where the outer casing of the engine was anchored, and the force ripped that casing apart and flung heavy pieces of it back over the wing. One chunk the size of a serving tray flew up and struck the side of the fuselage, punching straight through a passenger window. The window blew out, and the cabin lost its pressure in an explosive instant. Everything loose was dragged toward the opening, and the passenger seated beside it was forced headfirst into the gap. In the cockpit, the pilots heard the bang and felt the aircraft roll hard to the left, dragged down by the shattered engine. Alarms told them the cabin had lost pressure. For 11 seconds, the jet banked steeply before the first officer wrestled at level, and the two pilots pulled on their oxygen masks in a cockpit filled with the roar of rushing wind. They began an emergency descent, cut off the ruined engine, and turned toward Philadelphia. On the radio, the captain's voice stayed remarkably calm, reporting that they had lost an engine and were coming down, and later, telling the controller that part of the aircraft was missing and that a passenger had gone partway out. One man began broadcasting the cabin live to the internet, but the pilots were fully in command, driving the jet down as fast as they safely could. Back in the cabin, the fight to save the woman at the window was desperate. The winds tearing past the opening had pinned her against the fuselage, and it took the combined strength of passengers and crew to drag her back inside. They laid her across the seats, and a nurse and a paramedic among the travelers took over, working to revive her. She had been struck with terrible force, and despite everything they did, she could not be saved. The pilots brought the aircraft down to a smooth landing in Philadelphia, and the cabin erupted in applause as it rolled to a stop. Of the 149 people aboard, only one had died. The woman at the window, the first passenger killed aboard a United States airliner in more than 9 years. What the investigation uncovered was unsettling in its own quiet way. The engine casing had done its job. The blade never escaped it. The failure lay in a single, unforeseen possibility, a blade striking one precise point that decades of testing and computer modeling had simply never imagined. There was no villain here, no cut corner, only a hidden flaw in the design that had waited more than 20 years for the one blade to break in exactly the wrong place. For almost 2 years, a search team combed the Greenland ice sheet for a piece of metal. It had fallen from the sky at tremendous speed, punched a small crater into the ice, and vanished beneath the snow before anyone could reach it. Teams flew radar over the glaciers, dug through crevasse fields, and finally pulled it out from 4 meters down. It was the shattered core of a jet engine, and finding it was the only way to explain how one of the largest airliners ever built nearly came apart over the North Atlantic. The aircraft was an Airbus A380, the double-decked giant that is the biggest passenger jet in the world, carrying 521 people from Paris to Los Angeles. It had 4 engines, 2 under each wing, and it was cruising high over the frozen expanse near Greenland, hours from anywhere. Most of the passengers were doing what people do on a long flight, watching films or sleeping, with no sense that anything was wrong. Then the outermost engine on the right side let go. The failure was severe and sudden. The entire front of that engine, including the great spinning hub that holds the fan blades, tore away from the aircraft and fell toward the ice below. What remained on the wing was a ragged, gaping ruin where a smooth engine cowling had been just moments before. The passengers seated on that side had a clear and frightening view of it, the front of the engine simply gone, and their photographs and videos would soon travel around the world. Yet for all its violence, the failure did something unusual. The heavy fan hub broke away cleanly and fell from the aircraft, rather than firing shrapnel inward through the wing and the cabin. The fuel tanks were not breached. The other 3 engines kept running. There was no fire and no loss of pressure. The aircraft had been badly wounded, but it was still flying, and it was still controllable. In the cockpit, the crew felt the jolt and saw the warnings for the failed engine. They were in one of the most remote stretches of airspace on any major route, far out over the ocean between continents, with no airport close at hand. Staying calm, they shut the ruined engine down and worked out where they could go. The nearest suitable runway was at a military base at Goose Bay, in the far east of Canada, and they turned toward it and began a long, careful descent, nursing the enormous jet down on its 3 good engines. The passengers endured a tense wait as the aircraft made its way toward land. There was little the cabin could do but sit with the knowledge of that broken engine out on the wing, hoping the rest would hold. They did. The crew brought the crippled giant down to a smooth landing at Goose Bay, and all 521 people aboard were safe. The base was so remote and so unused to handling a jet of that size that the passengers had to wait aboard until other aircraft could be sent the next day to carry them onward. The mystery of why it happened is what sent investigators onto the ice. Once the fan hub was finally recovered from the glacier, they could examine the break in the metal, and they found the culprit was a rare and insidious form of fatigue. Deep inside the titanium of the hub, a crack had formed in a way that leaves almost no outward trace, growing slowly during the long cold hours of high-altitude flight, in a spot no ordinary inspection had been designed to check. It was the kind of flaw that hides not because anyone was careless, but because no one yet knew exactly where to look.